Let me click where'd my mouse go? There we go. Okay, awesome. So we're going to be talking about, well, first of all, thank you for the introduction, Hassan. My name is Kenton. I am the founder of RocketBlocks, worked at Google and Zynga Flurry earlier in my career in product management. And we're going to be talking all about product management interview prep today. I'm excited to cover this topic with all of you. It's something that's near and dear to my heart. Spent a lot of time thinking about this. And of course, my company RocketBlocks helps all sorts of candidates prepare for interviews, including product management, of course. So let's go ahead and jump in here. What's our agenda for today? I want to try and keep this super simple. There's a whole ton of different things that you can discuss when you start thinking about product management and going down the interview path. But what I want to do today is really focus us on 3 specific questions. Some of these questions right now, I think off the bat, are going to seem a little bit basic. So bear with me. I think you'll see that there's a lot of nuance to these as we start walking through them. But the first is, what are PM interviews? Again, sounds like a super basic question, but it's not as obvious as one might think, especially if you're going through it for the first time. The second thing we're going to talk about is what matters in PM interviews. What should you be thinking about if you are preparing for those interviews, going through them, et cetera. And then lastly, what's the most efficient way to prep? So really, that's all we're going to try and answer today. If you take nothing else away from this presentation, what I want all of you to get is a good answer to each of these 3 questions. And I think if you get that, it'll set you up for having a good sort of plan, process, and like a roadmap through the PM interview prep process. So since there's a bunch of folks on this call, and it's going to be, at least in the beginning, largely me talking at all of you, what I would love to do, because it's super helpful for me to know how much experience, where people are in their process, is if in the chat, everyone could put 2 things. One, put what your dream PM job is. And then the second thing, don't put anything yet. Let me say the 2 things first. So what's your dream PM job? And then the second thing is, on a scale of 1 through 3, how prepped are you for PM interviews today? 1 is like, I don't even really know what PM interviews are like yet. I'm trying to figure that out. 2 is like, I sort of know what they're like, and I've started doing some preparation. And 3 is like, I've been through like the gamut. I may have done like PM interviews before, or I've done a bunch of mock interviews and I really know what's going on. So put that in the chat. What's your dream job? And 1, 2, or 3, how prepared are you for PM interviews? With 3 being, I've done a lot of preparation, and 1 is like, I'm brand new to this. Okay, and I'm gonna watch a few of these answers coming in. So product manager, Google, PM at a reputable ed tech company. I like that. As someone that works in ed tech, career tech myself. I like Sarah's got a very specific answer, 2.05. PM tech, PM at big tech, game companies, Microsoft PM. Varun, I like that. Any company that will pay me. Okay, great. So for folks that haven't shared yet, feel free to put that in there. I'll keep an eye on the chat as we're going through this. It's helpful for me to know just sort of what experience level everyone on the call is coming to this presentation with. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This is my background. This is my career at a snapshot. I basically worked as a product manager at really big companies like Google, although it's a lot bigger now than it was when I was there, but still a big company. I think it was 5,000 people when I joined, 20,000 people when I left. Worked at Zynga, much smaller company, about a couple hundred people when I joined, maybe 2,000 people when I left. And then Flurry, a much smaller company, 100-person company. So I've worked in product across a different range of companies, different size scales, different problems, different interview processes. And what I'm really going to try and do is try and distill and codify some of that interview knowledge about the PM process for all of you today. And then lastly, before I actually jump into the content, the last thing I'll say is, as I do these presentations and workshops, like the more interactive they are, generally the better. So if I'm going through anything in the next few slides and you have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself, ask that question, or put it in the chat. I'll keep an eye on the chat. The more, if you have a question, chances are someone else in the chat is also going to have a question. So there's no stupid questions in this. We're all just trying to learn, get better, have successful careers. So go for it. Okay. So who on this call, these are some old screenshots of video mock interviews I have from when I was in business school in 2011. But I'm curious, for the folks that have said on the chat, 3, 2 in terms of product management level, how many people have just started doing a ton of mock interviews to prep for PM interviews? Okay, I'm seeing a few, one very enthusiastic, me. So I think when you start going through this process, and I was in the same bucket when I was in business school, I was in the same bucket when I was in undergrad graduating. When I first heard what these interviews were like, people basically, told me the way to get good at these interviews is just go do a ton of them, right? If you have one of these interviews coming up, the way to get good at that type of interview is go do a bunch of those interviews. And the reality is that I think that answer, if you've got an interview, just go do a ton of interviews to get good at it, it's only sort of half true. And what I want to talk about today, and the answer to that first question is why is it only half true? And I'm curious, does anyone have an idea of why just doing a bunch of mock interviews to prepare for a PM interview isn't necessarily the right way to prep? Does anyone have a guess? Shayna said it's too generalized. I think that there's something interesting in that idea. Shayna, do you want to take that a little further? Jordan and Denisha, they have to be good. That's a good point. If you're doing a mock interview with someone and it's not realistic or whatnot, it may not end up being good prep. Radhika says to develop problem-solving skill. Zena, PM is not usually a specific job description. You need to focus on specific company or product. So Shayna's answer is getting at something that I'll talk about more that I think is really important. What did Purav say? There has to be a defined plan about how you approach each specific company. Also sort of true. I think that the one thing I want to call out about Shayna and Purav's comments that I'll talk about a little bit is that if you're going through interviews and you end up in a world where you're preparing specifically for every single company you're going through, and you're doing specific prep for that company, and a lot of it, that's going to get you're going to get really busy really quickly, because it's a lot of work to do that for each company. So we'll come back to that, but we'll put a pin in that. What I want you to think about when you're going through PM interviews is the first thing is basically PM interviews. When we talk about what is a PM interview is an exercise designed to test a basket of skills. That's the first key thing you need to remember. Everyone sort of knows that it's product case questions, and there's this type of case question and maybe that type of case question, but it's this big scary process. You're going to have to drive the interview, etc. That all is true in a sense, but at the end of the day, what these interviews are is an exercise designed to test a basket of skills. The company that you're interviewing with is trying to determine, does he, she, they have the right set of skills to succeed on the job? And the way they do that is generally through a series of case questions and maybe a series of behavioral questions. But those are just the fodder. They're the context for trying to understand if you have this basket of skills. And so what does the basket of skills matter? Well, there's all these different skills that matter in product management. We're going to talk about a bunch more of them, things like product sense, estimation skills, technical skills, analytical skills. And so the interview itself is basically just, it's an exercise to see what's in your basket of skills. That's what the company really wants to know. And if you think about on the other side of the table, what's an interviewer doing? Well, they basically have a sheet of paper or a notepad open on their computer or something. They're taking notes about how they think you're performing on certain skill sets. At the end of the day, they're going to have an overall assessment of how you did, but more specifically, they're going to be sitting there, and for the basket of skills that company cares about, they're going to be sort of checking off boxes and saying yeah, I think this person, their quantitative and estimation skills are really good. They seem really analytical and data driven. I don't know about their product sense skills. That seems a little fuzzy. I don't know, maybe their technical stuff, maybe that's not as strong. But the idea is, and this is like why this matters for you, is that's actually how they're evaluating. They're thinking about you on all these individual dimensions and indices, not just like overall, like, is this person good at product cases? So let me pause there. For anyone, for folks following along, right? Is any of this confusing or nonsense to folks? Does anyone have any questions they want to throw into the chat so far? Or is everyone with me? I don't see any questions so far. Okay, all good. That's good. So answer to the first question, like, what is a PM interview? It's an exercise basically designed to test a basket of skills. Now let's move on basically to the second question. Let's talk about, well, what is in that basket? What are the different skills that folks want to see tested? And importantly, to like Shayna's point and Purov's point earlier, how much does it differ from company to company? The really good news is that at the end of the day, especially at the entry level, if you're at the beginning of your career, if you're trying to get your first PM job, if you're graduating from undergrad, coming out of some boot camp or vocational program, or maybe you've done product school, whatever, all these companies are essentially looking for mostly the same skill set. There's going to be a little bit of variation from company to company, and certain companies are going to have different words for certain skills. But at the end of the day, if you like interview PMs at all the leading companies, and I've done this, I've actually sat down and interviewed, I have no idea how many it is at this point. It's probably like 100 plus product managers, and said, when you're hiring for your company, what skills matter? You interview folks, they all basically say this same list of like 6 things that's here. Now, there's some variation, right? Some companies care more or less about certain things. And let's take like a popular example, right? Like a company like Google is fairly technical. It had co-founders that were technical themselves. Larry and Sergey were engineers. And they had a strong bias when they first started hiring PMs that their PMs should be technical like they were. And that's sort of just how they thought about it. They were like, if they need to work with engineers, they should also have a CS degree. And so they sort of set that requirement. And over time, even though Google has loosened that, what's happened is that's become codified in Google's hiring practice. And so they hire generally, and they think and look for more technical people. So all of these companies like Google cares about, product sense, product design skills. Are you analytically driven? Technically fluent? Can you do things like estimations and market sizing and can communicate clearly? And do you have leadership skills? But each company, they may index on these a little bit differently. So Google may care that you're really technically fluent versus say like maybe Airbnb, that's going to be like less concerned about whether you're, super technical, because the product that they work on maybe is like less technical in nature than say working on backend for Google search, or, maybe a certain job focused on like building out APIs, right? You need to be pretty technical to do that. So the key thing that you want to think about is, you're going through these interviews, they're an exercise designed to test a basket of skills. What's the basket of skills that matter? The good news is that there's, 6 big skill set buckets that are really common that every company cares about. And when you start thinking about that, I think the really good news is that as you start thinking about, well, going through an interview, if I'm walking into an interview with company X or company Y or company Z, or say you have 30 interviews, every letter of the alphabet plus some, then, if you're trying to do company specific prep for all of those over and over, you're trying to reinvent the wheel each time, it's going to be a lot of work and it's going to be really, really hard to do well. Whereas if you approach it with a common set of like, here's like the 6 skills that I really need to demonstrate to do well. And then, I know that I'm going to say Airbnb and they're a little more design focused than the average PM role. And I'm going to, do a little bit of research on their business model and things like that so that I can speak to why I'm really interested in it. So that's totally fine. I'm not saying you don't have to do that, but if you take this approach, which is like, hey, what are the core skills that they care about? And you focused on doing your prep around building those core skills, then you can leverage that over time in every interview you walk into. Additionally, once you're on the job, if you've been building these skill sets, and these are what actually make you a good product manager once you're on the job, then you have a leg up once you start, right? Because you've had like this skill focused mindset where you're actually building the same skills that you're going to use on the job. Okay. So let me pause because there was a few questions that came up. Kevin asked, at which stage are these skills tested? Good question. So if you think about an interview process for product management, there's generally like a few stages. There's the phone screen stage. This is usually with a recruiter, sometimes with a hiring manager, where they just try and suss out, is this person a credible candidate? Should we spend some time interviewing them full time? Then there's first round interviews, which depending on the company might be one round, maybe it's two separate interviews with two different people. And then usually there's some final round interview, which is like a panel of interviews. Maybe it's 3 interviews on the small side. Maybe it's like 7, 8. Sometimes it's like, I don't know, 10 on the long side, but probably mostly final rounds are like somewhere between 3 to 5 interviews. So where are these skills getting tested? Basically the first round and second round interviews, that's like the meat of where these skills are going to get tested. Sometimes in the phone screen, like at a company like, let's see, I don't know. Maybe a unicorn company, they may have like the recruiter ask you a few things to try and get a sense of like, does this person have some product design sense, et cetera. Usually they're not going to be asking you like case type questions at that point. They may just ask about a few things on your resume to try and suss it out. So really the phone screen is usually just like, does this person seem like they could be a credible candidate? Do they have like rough culture fit with what they're looking for? And then the first and second round interviews is where these skills are really going to get tested. So hopefully that helps answer that question for you, Kevin. Any other questions before I move on for thinking about like how to actually prepare and build these skills?
Hi, Kenton. I had a quick question.
Yeah.
With regards to these FANG companies, right? The big 5 companies. I know that Amazon is very like business oriented, like they prefer MBA candidates. So just wondering which other of those FANG companies are very like business oriented?
Of the FANG companies, probably the most business oriented aside from Amazon might be Microsoft, where the product managers, historically, not always, but like have really had like a strong go-to-market focus, like the business side of the problem. Google, often product managers, they're very focused on like the tech, the product itself. Obviously, there's plenty of MBAs that are product managers at Google as well, but I would say Microsoft is probably the answer to that question. To Radhika's question, do you need to have a business background like an MBA? The answer is no, you don't need an MBA to be a product manager. I think one of the cool things about product management is since it is a job of like many hats, like you work with engineers, you work with designers, you work with salespeople, marketers, et cetera. There's a bunch of different areas that you can be really good in. Like just look at this skill set. Like maybe you're a great PM because you're really good technically and you bring really good technical insights to the team and that helps push you forward. Or maybe you're really good at product management because you have incredible product sense, product design skills. So the reality is that there's a bunch of different ways to be good at product management, which means that there's no one standard way to get into product management. You absolutely do not need an MBA to get into product management. There are many product managers that have an MBA, and that's totally fine. But there's many PMs that just start in job X, like they start in marketing and they realize they like product management and they switch into that. Or there's some PMs that, just like they got a CS degree in undergrad and decide like, hey, I like coding, I like technical stuff, but I also like doing all this other aspect of the work, and they may go into product management instead of engineering or something like that.
Thanks, Kenton.
Yep. Cool. So let's go to question 3. Before I do that, so who's on screen, and someone tell me who is this guy and what do we think he's doing here?
He's Stephen Curry and he's doing a crossover.
Okay. Yeah. That might even be more technical than I know because I don't really know anything about basketball. It does look like a crossover, I assume, is like dribbling where you dribble between your legs. Is that right? Okay. He's doing that. My guess is he's also about to he's got a rack of balls back there, right? So he's probably doing maybe he's doing some dribbling and then shooting. Regardless of what specifically he's doing here, right? I think the key takeaway is he's not in the middle of a game. This is some sort of practice exercise he's doing where he's probably working on as I'm not sure who it was who spoke up, but like a crossover, or maybe it's a crossover plus a 3-point shot, but it's something specific. He's not playing the full game of basketball. He's working on a targeted skill and developing that particular skill. And that is the key thing that I want to point out as the answer to the third question. Like when you're thinking about how do I actually prepare for these interviews, the answer isn't where we started, which was like, hey, should I just do a ton of mock interviews? That would be like Steph Curry saying like, hey, I've got NBA finals coming up. The way I'm going to get good at this is just play a million basketball games. Now, obviously, he's going to play some basketball games, right? But he's going to do other targeted skill building practice to make sure he's really good at his crossover dribbling, or his like 3-point shots, you know, or maybe like passing drills or set plays, things like that. Or maybe he's even just going to like do running to build up his endurance. There are all these specific things he's going to do. And that's the same thing that you want to keep in mind as you're approaching product management interviews, is don't just try and do a bunch of mock interviews. Get into a practice where you're basically doing targeted skill building practice on the skill sets that matter. So on those 6 skills that we were talking about, and then occasionally go do a mock interview and test yourself on those skills, and then collect feedback from that mock interview and go back and work on building your skills again, and then repeat that process. So basically ends up like a skill building loop. You're building your skills, going and testing those skills in a live mock interview environment, taking notes on what you did well, what didn't go as well, and then going back and practicing. So in practice, that might look like this. You basically might say, okay, like, hey, like I'm like, maybe you're an engineer by trade. You did CS in undergrad, you worked as an engineer, you're really good technically. Like if someone asks you what an API is, how the internet works, anything like that, you're like, great, I know how to answer that question. This is a breeze, whatnot. But if someone says, hey, can you design this new feature for a product? You're like, I don't know. That's like, you know, that's not my strength. You need to build up that particular skill. So you'd start in the top of the circle up here, you know, at like assessing, like, you know, okay, what am I good at? What am I not as good? You might be like, okay, I'm not great at product sense. Well, then you go spend some time building product sense muscles, like answering product sense questions, thinking about like, how would you design a product feature in X case or Y case? Basically doing drills that are going to help you build up that muscle. And then third step, this is where you test, you go do a mock interview. You see if how you're doing in that particular skill set, you get some feedback, and then you go back and you either drill yourself some more, or you're like, okay, like, hey, I'm getting really good at that. I don't need to practice that anymore. I'm going to move on to this other skill that, you know, I'm struggling. And basically you repeat this loop as much as you can. You know, I think a lot of folks think that like interviewing, or some folks think that like interviewing is just like, you just like walk in and you try and demonstrate your skills, or some people are naturally good at things and not others. And like the interview will just like suss that out, et cetera. All of this stuff is learnable. And the way you learn it is just the same way that like a world-class athlete like Steph Curry or, you know, Serena Williams, anyone like that prepares for their job, which is, you know, just happens to be an athletic job. Our job in this case is getting a PM job. And, you know, most of you, I assume, just based off what folks said in the chat about like dream jobs and where folks were in their prep process, you know, you may be trying to break into product management for the first time. There's probably a lot of folks that are early in their career here. I just want to like, I was on a mock interview call that I did with my friend the other day, a friend from business school, who is a director of product at a FANG company. Like in all, if people think about what does it mean to have made it, you're like, oh, director of product at a FANG company, right? Like he's doing great. He's got another interview, and he told me, I've interviewed hundreds of people over the last like 5 years, but I like myself, I'm rusty on this stuff. Like I haven't practiced my skills in an interview setting in a while. So can you help? And like, of course, I'm happy to help them. But the point is like, it's just a set of skills and everyone faces the same challenge. And so all you need to do is just like break it down, like have a process and then practice those skills. And everyone goes through the same challenge. So the good news is like, if you're feeling like this is intimidating, like, oh, like, how am I ever going to get this? Like, know that like people that are already like, have done really well in their careers, they're facing the same thing. Like everyone just needs to figure out how to demonstrate these skills and go through that process. Okay, so we are just about half hour in. I think there were like a few questions that popped up that I'm going to try and look at and make sure I answer. Let's see. So Shayna asked, how much of the candidate evaluation is based on prior PM experience? I mean, it's going to vary per company, Shayna, but a quick answer is that like, for the most part, the company is going to care about, can you demonstrate these skills? And in the behavioral part of the interview, they may ask you to tell you about times you've demonstrated those skills X and Y. But when it comes to like actually like product case type questions, they're just going to want to see like how well you can demonstrate those live on the fly. Rahul mentioned, I just finished my final round PM at Facebook and is also not technical, focused on product design and metrics execution. Good point. Facebook, I think, one of the unique companies out there of the bigger companies that basically said we are not going to test PM candidates on technical things. They have 3 very specific areas they test PM candidates on: product sense, product design, what they call product execution, which is really sort of like analytics and metrics and data-driven questions, and then leadership questions. And obviously like communication gets tested throughout all of those different areas.
And this is Rahul. Just so for Google, I'm going through the PM process with Google right now, and I have my final round on Thursday. And out of the 5 interviews in the final round, only one of them is technical, and one of them is just with a software engineer on, describing how the internet works, or if you're going to add a specific feature. But then all the other 4 are like similar to Facebook, where it's like product design and execution, all that.
Yep. Yeah. So I mean, I think that is pretty common at many PM interview processes, right? Like generally what happens is like you'll have like a panel of interviews, and at most companies, not all, those different folks in the panel are going to be trying to test you on different skill areas. So one might be focused on product sense, one might be focused on analytics or product execution, one might be focused on technical, that type of thing. Some companies, right, like I said, like if you went through one of those panels at Airbnb, they may not really focus anyone on technical. They may just focus more on product sense, product design, like, are you data minded, et cetera. Okay. Okay. So I'll answer 2 more of these questions, and then we'll move on, and then we'll address the rest in Q&A, because Hassan told me we're going to spend a little bit of time on doing a mini mock interview, and I want to make sure we've got some time to go through that. Shayna, to the question of like resources to support these action items, yes, like we'll get it sent out afterwards, but RocketBlocks is designed specifically with this sort of philosophy in mind of the way to prepare for interviews is to isolate what skills are actually getting tested and then do drills to actually go through and practice those particular skills and get good at them. And so there's things like, the types of questions that are going to come up, sample answers from expert PMs, et cetera. To Kevin's questions, any idea on skills prioritized by Financial Force ERP during the interview process? I have a simple and fast answer to that, Kevin. No, I don't. I'm not familiar with that company. What I would say, and this is important, and this applies to everyone on the call, as I mentioned on that skill slide, we're looking at those 6 skills. That set of skills is very commonly tested by almost every company, but every company is going to have their own little tweaks, right? We said like Facebook doesn't really care about technical. Google may care more about technical. Airbnb, might not, et cetera. When you're going through the process, ask your recruiter or the hiring manager, whoever you're in contact with, what skills does this company really care about? What are the skill sets that they believe really define like a successful PM? Usually most folks will tell you. You're probably going to get a very similar list to what we're talking about. But in some cases, they may say, well, at company X, like design is super important. And so we're going to specifically like test you on like user experience and some design stuff. That's good to know. Ask that type of stuff, because the particular flavor of interviews that you might get might vary a little bit company to company. And you want that knowledge, obviously, going into the interviews. Okay, so let's do a mock interview question. This is the question we're going to walk through. I'm going to read it out loud, and then I've got the list of folks up on the chat. So if no one raises their hand, I may cold call on someone, but my guess is everyone's participating a lot. So someone's probably going to raise their hand. We can also do some team solving if folks want, but let me read the question first, and then we'll get a participant from the audience, from the lovely audience here, to actually try and walk through and answer this question live. But let's say Gmail is considering adding a new delayed send functionality, which would allow a user to schedule an email that he or she wrote to be delivered at some point in the future. You'll be the PM responsible for launching it. Which key parts of the Gmail tech stack would require work to launch something like this? So for folks that use Gmail, which I imagine is a lot of people on here, you will probably realize that this is functionality that now is live. When I wrote this slide, which I think I originally probably made a couple of years ago, this functionality didn't exist. But it's still a good question to ask because, and it's still the type of thing that comes up in interviews. It often happens, people ask about something that just launched or that might launch, or maybe they're thinking about launching, but a competitor has already launched it. The idea is not that it's about a brand new feature, but in this case, it's thinking about, can you articulate how the technical parts of a tech stack might fit together to support a product like this? So does anyone on the call want to take a stab at answering this question? Anyone? I see one hand raised. Go for it.
Hi everyone, I'm Yash Chaudhary. I want to try this, but I have many follow-up questions.
Sure, go for it.
Firstly, when we say tech stack needed to launch this feature, are we talking about the backend or the UX also?
So it's a good clarifying question. What I'm interested in an answer to this question is, what are all the different components of the tech stack, both the front end and the back end, and maybe a little bit just like, tell me a little bit on the user experience, what would have to be there to make this functionality work?
And do we also have to say about the timeline for the tech stack? I mean, by when do we have to deliver it? Do we have to change the whole thing, or we have a specific timeline? Like, we want this feature in 6 months, so we make minimalistic changes or something like that.
Yeah, so I'm less concerned about the timeline here, less operationally focused. I just want you to sort of walk me through, like, hey, if we were actually going to build this, if you're the PM that needs to build this, help me understand that you know all the different components, maybe the people that you would have to have conversations with about, hey, we're trying to build X, so that means we need to do Y and Z, et cetera, but less concerned about the specific timing of it.
I can try right now. So when we create the mail, there's a create mail option, and over that there are a lot of options above it which talks about the editing options for the mail, the font you want to use, BCC, CCC,
yeah,
CC2. Probably there we need to add a button or a feature to have a delayed response or send it later option.
Okay.
And that being sent, probably in the mail after sending it can go into outbox with a time frame that, okay, it will be sent, it will go from outbox to the send probably after the time which we have set. So we need to build that functionality. We also have to link it to the backend, to the cloud, so that it's available to all the other devices where you have logged in.
Okay.
So if we have set it up to be delivered after a day, so we can take our phone and then edit it again if you want to do it.
Okay.
So so from backend, this is the thing that we have to build, and from the UX, how to go about the transitioning from create mail to outbox and to send. This is the functionality we might have to build.
Okay, good. That seems like a good first step. Can you tell me a little bit more about, like, on the back end, like what let's say we're Gmail today, right? We have the functionality like you create an email, you click send, it gets sent off. But now we want to live in a world where you can either send that email immediately or you can schedule it at some point in the future. What, like, just like walk me through on the back, like, what do we need to build to sort of accomplish that? Like, what sort of, I don't know, mechanics do we need to make that happen?
So when we send an email, probably it gets stored in some database or cloud. So we need to create probably another row into the database, which I believe already exists because we can see all our mails live. So probably we need to create another row and few more columns saying, so if you check the database there, it might be message to CC, BCC, and options like when it was sent and when it was received. So there we have to add another column saying a time, preferred time to be sent or something like that, so that we can refer it and call it whenever we need it and update it. So probably we need few more columns like that, like those. Yeah, need to add it in the existing database probably. And so we just need a feature to fetch it from the database.
Tell me more about that part. So I totally agree. Like you want to add a column to the database. It's going to have a piece of information that says when this email is supposed to be sent, like either now for the regular emails or some point in the future for these emails. What's this other thing you were talking about fetching?
So when we create a mail, after we send a send button, there should be an API call to the backend system from the UX, basically, which will that API call will store the data into the database and fill the will populate the row with all the features, and at the same time, if we are on laptop, this is what happens. When we are on phone, then it should have a feature to update it automatically. So again, there's a call to get call basically to whenever there's an update on your phone, like whenever you refresh it on your phone and you have created the mail through your laptop, the get call will update everything from your laptop, from the cloud server basically to your phone.
Sure.
So that's a get call.
Okay.
And yeah, that's it.
Okay, cool. Okay, great job. Can we all give a round of applause? I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
I'm Yash.
I'm Yash. Okay.
Yash. Yeah.
Everyone, please give a round of applause to Yash. It's very hard to do mock interviews in general or interviews at all, and to do it in front of 40 other people is brave. So good. Thank you for taking a stab at it. I think so at least from what I heard and understand correctly, I think you talked about a lot of the components that I would touch on if someone asked me this question. A few sort of things that I would point out and think about, one on sort of the content of the answer and one on the approach to it. So the first thing I'll mention on the approach is if you get, any of these questions that you get, as you're walking through, it's really helpful to structure and tell the interviewer how you sort of plan on approaching the question. So if you can say like, hey, like, do you mind if I take like 30 seconds, 60 seconds, whatever, to organize my thoughts so that you can sort of come up with an action plan. But what I think would have been great is if you started by saying, okay, like if we're going to build this, there is, 3 big areas I think we need to pay attention to where we need to make some changes. And the first is we need to do some things on, the front end and the user experience so that a user, knows that they can send a delayed send email. Like that's the first thing we need to do. And there's like a bunch of stuff there. And, we need to update the mobile clients and other things like you mentioned. Then we need to make some changes to the database because we got to store some new information about these new type of emails, when they're going to be sent, et cetera. So, and we'll talk about that. And then for me, at least, and then like, let's talk about this third bucket. And so just laying out that type of like, okay, here's how I want to approach the question can be very useful. You're basically giving your interviewer a roadmap for how you're going to answer their question, which is really nice because then it lets them know like how you plan on thinking about it. And then as you walk through it, you sort of like build credibility from your own approach to a question about like how you can think logically in a structured fashion, and in a very, clear way that's just like easy to understand. The one thing I'll mention is if you throw out like a framework like that, like you say, like, I'm going to talk about these 3 things, and then you start going through it. If you're going through the interview and you realize like, oh, there's like a 4th bucket I forgot to mention, or, oh, I realized like the 2nd bucket doesn't really matter and I want to swap it out with this other bucket, you are not married to the framework you proposed initially. So if that happens, just say, hey, as I've thought about this more, I realized that the 2nd bucket I proposed initially, I don't think it matters as much. And instead, I think we should talk about this. Your interviewer is not going to ding you for it. In fact, most of them will probably appreciate that you didn't stick with like a framework that you later realized like is suboptimal. Okay, so that's the first piece of feedback just on how you approach the question, Yash. Second piece of feedback is in a question like this, I think there are really 3 high-level buckets that matter. It's 1, the UX, which you talked about. 2, the database, which you also talked about. We're going to need to store some new information, either in the same table with some new columns, or maybe we create a new table for delayed send emails. Probably the former, but like either could work. And then the third thing that's really critical in this, that I think this is the part that I didn't hear you say anything about, or maybe I missed, but is what's the process that's going to happen to go look over the database and say, when should these emails be sent? Do we need to send any emails that got stored to the database but weren't sent immediately? Because if you think about how Gmail works before this feature exists, basically an email is created on the front end, it gets saved to a database, and then like Gmail sends it out, or maybe they send it out and save it to the database at the same time, or vice versa. It doesn't really matter, but they do something. And in this new world, there's actually a different process where an email will get saved to the database, but not sent at that moment. So some process needs to be written, some job, some queue, something that is going to look over the database on some cadence in the future and then send emails when they need to be sent. And there's a whole lot of decisioning that's going to go into that, right? Like, should that process run every hour? Well, if it only runs every hour, like what if someone wants to schedule their email to send on the half hour or at a specific minute? And what if the UI lets them do that, but then the backend script doesn't support that? There's a lot of like interesting product decisions about how often that script runs, and then the trade-offs. Like you could say, well, we'll let that, we'll support every single edge case of when someone wants to send an email. So we'll run that script every millisecond, every single millisecond. We're just going to run that script. Well, your engineers might be like, that's a little, resource intensive to be running that every millisecond. What about if we just run it every second or every 10 seconds? So I don't know what the right answer is, and there's a bunch of back and forth, but that's the type of stuff. I think those are the 3 big buckets of things you want to think about in this particular question. So I'm going to pause there. So just to recap, what we basically talked about is if you're going into PM interviews, I think there's 3 things you really want to think about. What are the interviews? And the key thing I want you to think about there is they're not this big amorphous blob. They're not just product cases or whatnot. They're an exercise that's designed to test a basket of skills. Over the course of the whole, interview from phone screen all the way through final round, the company is trying to test whether you have a particular basket of skills. The second thing is basically like, what is that basket? Like we said, it's going to vary a little bit company to company, but there are like 6 super common things that almost all companies are looking for. Now, they may index a little differently in how much they care about each. And some companies, like we said, right, they may have another skill they care about, or maybe they've swapped one skill for the other. But almost across the board, like every company is going to care about your product sense, product design skills. They're going to care that you're analytically minded, data-driven. They're going to want some sort of technical ability for you. Notably, there are some exceptions like Facebook, like we talked about. They're going to want communication skills, leadership skills, and maybe like, like estimation, quant, market sizing type skills. Maybe someone like Airbnb wants design, they swap that out, et cetera. But there's this common skill set, and that's what you want to think about building those skills. And then that leads into the third part we talked about, which is, well, how do I build those skills efficiently? is take a page out of Steph Curry's book or Serena Williams' book. Think about this like they prepare for their matches and games. It's not just about doing a million mock interviews. You want to think about what are the skills that matter? What skills am I good at? What am I weaker at? And then do targeted practice to build up the areas where you need prep. And then go into mock interviews occasionally and test. How am I doing? Like, hey, I've done a bunch of practice answering technical questions. Then I did a mock interview. Am I any better at that? Am I getting better? Am I making progress? Same thing. And then just go through that loop. So those are my sort of 3 key recommendations as you're approaching PM interview prep. And we've got 12 minutes left on the clock. So I'm happy to open it up for questions. And we will go from there. Get any questions you have answered. So I see, let's see. I can't see the name of it, but who is that? Why can't I see your name? I don't know why I can't see folks' names, but why doesn't someone just unmute and speak? Because I can't see the name.
Go ahead, guys.
Okay.
Radhika?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So, hi, Kenton. I have one question. Let's say if we get a product, we get this kind of question. So in this case, we know how Gmail works because this is very, very common. But in case if we get kind of a product which we are not aware of from before and we don't know how it works. So in that case, is it okay to create our own hypothesis? Like in this case, we just said that, okay, Gmail works with an integration with a database. But in a similar kind of question, let's say, we don't know what technology is actually working in the backend. So is it okay if we make our own hypothesis and then on the basis of that, we create the entire answer for the backend part?
Yeah, it's always okay to form your own hypotheses. You can always check, right? Like no one expects you to know, and you probably no way to know, right? Like I don't know what backend database Gmail's actually running. But you can make some reasonable assumptions, like I assume they have a database, and that's probably a fair assumption, right? Like the information is getting stored somewhere. And so you can always say, well, here's my assumption about some of the key things that are probably in place to support the product they have today. Does that sound reasonable? And they might say like, yeah, like that sounds great. Like, so how would we have to change that type of stuff? And again, no one's going to expect you to know like the particular languages or things that they've used. Like they're expecting you to talk about like the right components and what might be changed. Like the reason why I like this particular technical question we did is because if you think about it, like you don't even need to be like a CS major to think through those different components. Like even if you didn't know all the right terms, you could be like, well, we need some button that lets the users like set a time for when it should be sent. And we need to put that information somewhere. Like you may not know what a database is, but you're like, we got to put it somewhere. And then we have to do something to go find where we put it and figure out where to send it. Like if someone gave me that answer really clearly and crisply in an interview, but didn't know any of the terms, I would still be like they're getting all the right stuff. And that's what's more important, because as a product manager, like you're not going to be writing the code. Like you're never going to sit down and write production code if you're a PM at Google. And even if you're at a small startup, it's probably not going to happen. Like your job is to focus on how things fit together, how the product fits together, how the product can be brought to market, how you can get your sales team to sell it, understand the value prop, et cetera, like all those different things. It's not, the minutia of like, hey, in that example, right? Like they don't really care like how exactly all the details of what language you use to write the script that finds emails and then goes and send them. But they care that you know about the fact that, hey, we're going to need something to go do that. And what I care about as a PM is like, if we let users on the front end set emails to be sent at specific minutes, we better be able, we got to have that script to be able to support that. So it's going to have to run at least every minute. That's like the type of thing that like a PM should really care about, not like whether that script is written in Python or Ruby or PHP or whatever.
So more like the logical flow and the integration between the teams and the integration basically between the code, right?
Yes.
That's sort of what is being judged.
Yeah. That's what people ultimately care about.
Yeah. Okay. That answers my question. Thank you so much.
Great. Yeah. Okay. There is a gentleman who, there's a few other folks got their hands raised. Again, I don't know.
Sure. No worries. I'll help you out.
Yes,
Arjun, I believe you had your hand raised.
For sure, thanks. So I have two quick questions, Kenton. So I mean, there are certain roles called technical product manager.
Yep.
For those kind of roles, would somebody with a CS sort of a background be a preferable candidate?
Yeah, so usually when that distinction exists, and not all companies have this, but there are some companies that will have like a technical PM versus like a PM. Usually when that exists, the technical PMs are given roles staffed in projects where what they're doing is more technical in nature. And a CS degree often will be super helpful. But again, sometimes may not be necessary, because maybe like the technical stuff you're doing is like, you could learn it without a CS degree. But, you know, like the example I usually give is like, hey, like if you're applying to Uber, right? And I don't know if Uber has TPMs and PMs, but you could imagine like if there's like PMs at Uber that manage like their APIs that third parties use. Like that's the type of role that could be like a TPM role. Whereas like someone focused on, say, rider growth at Uber, like the key part of that particular PM role is probably not super technical. It's more about user psychology and what can we do on the distribution front to like find new users and that type of stuff, new riders. So it's, you know, like that's the type of thing where sometimes, you know, the TPM roles might be more technical in nature, and a CS degree certainly could be helpful.
Sounds good. And just one quick other question was, if I was to get a subscription of RocketBlocks like today, right, and spend like 1-2 hours every day preparing, like how many months would it take to sort of go through the entire content of RocketBlocks?
It would take a while. What I can say is that like probably take a couple months. Depends on obviously your speeds, like your mileage may vary. But a few stats I can share is like, I think it's only like the top 2% of most engaged users actually ever go through all of the content in a particular module. So it's like very rare. Once you do get through that content, you can always revisit it, go back, practice again, etc. But yeah, you know, you'd have to be a super engaged user, and it'll probably take you a while. And again, it depends on how much time you spend reviewing each concept, going through each drill, etc. Okay, I think.
Thank you.
Of course.
Awesome.
Kevin,
Thank you for that question, Arjun. Kevin, could you please unmute yourself, please, and thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hi to everyone. I would like to know if there is a specific framework to know how to address or ask the clarification questions.
So
how do you know that you are asking the first good clarification questions?
So it's tricky. Because, you know, there's the general phrase, right? Like, has everyone heard, like, there's no such thing as like a bad question? And I think I said that earlier in the talk. I was sort of like, you know, like throw out your questions, right? And like in general, in learning experience environments like this, that is true. There's no such thing as a bad question. Like you should ask, because the point is to gain more knowledge. In interviews, I do think there are such things as bad clarifying questions. Generally, what I as an interviewer dislike is if I give if I throw out a question and someone clearly seems like they're just stalling, like they're just asking me like, oh, did you say X? Or like, you know, sometimes like you'll give a question and there's a bunch of numbers. And then some people will just like, I can see that they've like written down the numbers, but then they'll ask like, okay, let me confirm. Did you say 1,000 this? And I'm like, yes. And they're like, did you say this? And I'm like, yes. And I'm like, why? Like, it seems like you have all the information. Why are we wasting more time on this? It feels like they're stalling. So that type of stuff is bad. I think the type of stuff is good is when you hear one of these questions is, you know, questions that are honest, where you're trying to seek more information that narrows down either how you will approach the question or sort of informs like the direction you may take. So for example, if we think about the question Yash asked on this technical question, I think the first thing he asked was something about, it was like, I don't even remember. Well, Radhika asked a similar question. It's like, do we have to like talk about like the languages and the specific setup, or what if we don't know what sort of tech stack Gmail's using? That's a good question, right? Like, do I have to actually know the details, or can I make some assumptions? Like, that's sort of a good question that actually moves the process forward. And I think, Kevin, I don't know that that's a super satisfying answer. I think you need to use a little bit of a judgment, but certainly if you know that you're just throwing out clarifying questions to buy yourself time, you know, in some cases you might have to do that because maybe like you're completely flustered by the question and just need to like buy yourself some time. But like, you don't want to do that for the sake of doing it. So if you know you're just like throwing out sort of like questions to buy yourself time, like stop doing that and focus on questions that you actually have that would help you sort of dial in your approach to the particular question. Like, do I need to talk about X or can we jump to Y? That type of stuff. Okay, I see that Shayna's got her hands raised. I forgot that I can see the hand raised on the chat. So go for it, Shayna.
Hey, thanks so much for your workshop, by the way. It was so informative, first of all.
Awesome.
I guess quick question, this is not so related to like finding a role, but I guess in general, I'm curious to hear what you think about the whole like kind of feature war surrounding product. So there's a lot of product roles now where it seems like a lot of what people are working on are kind of like individual features or just sort of working on like one, like these small things to improve an existing overarching product. What are your thoughts on that? And like how much of a PM's responsibility is just like finding new little things to improve the existing product and how much of it is like looking at the whole picture? Like, what are your thoughts on that in general?
So there's many different types of PM roles out there. You can think maybe generally about like 3 different stages. There's like the 0 to 1 stage, which is like we're hiring a PM to like build the new product for the first time. The goal that PM has is to like take something from like basically nothing, like just an idea to like a product that's like in market. Then there's like, you know, PMs at many companies that may really be focused on like taking something that's like in market and like maybe it's just started working and really scaling that. So like, what's it going to take to get this from like 1,000 users to 1 million users, for example. And then there's like PMs that are like working on big, established, mature products, and they're just like refining and optimizing and making that product just a little bit better, just a little bit better. But those little improvements can have massive impact because the product's already at huge scale. So, you know, if you go work at like a Google or Microsoft, in many cases, you're going to be a PM in that third bucket where you're working on some big, mature, established product. And you might be building like little features or tweaks, and you know, you're still getting to take that feature from like idea through reality, which is like the role of a PM. And it may have like massive impact, but it may feel like a little tweak on a big product. You know, so part of the like that, there's a range of roles. I think that those 3 high-level ways are a good thing, like good classification to think about. You should just think about as a PM, which of those particular types of roles are most interesting to me. And depending on what of those are more interesting, use that information to modify your job search. So if you really like the 0 to 1 stage, you're probably going to get that at more startups, at more like unicorns, things like that, that maybe are building a bunch of new products, launching new stuff, and they need more people to do that. If you really like, you know, refining products that are out there, but maybe like a small revision, you don't have to go find brand new product market fit, but you can build a new feature and the next day, like 1 million people are using it. Like you can do that at Facebook. That's like a reality. If you go to a small startup, it's probably not going to build a feature and have 1 million people using it the next day. But you may do something you know, get a new product off the ground and then help start scaling it. And that could be really rewarding. So it's just personal preference and what type of company you end up going to and the scale they're at. Cool. We are at time, but I'm happy to take one more question if there is from anyone. And if not, I guess I can take this question from Joyce here, which was, when we consider the goal of improving existing products, I only can think of user acquisition, engagement, and monetization. Are there other aspects we can consider? So good question, Joyce. What I would say is there's always like a bunch of different things you can consider. You can improve products across almost any dimension out there that's there. How they engage folks, how they monetize, how you get user acquisition is a pretty good like high level framework that touches on a lot of that. But these questions can get asked in a bunch of different ways. And what I would say is it's good to have sort of like a default framework, but don't get so married to a default framework that if someone says like, hey, how would you improve product X? That's the only way you can think of it. You want to really make sure you absorb any particular question that's asked and the different flavor of the question and how it's posed and what's important. You know, there may be certain things that you want to explore that are outside of that. For example, like I could think of a way you could improve an existing product that's maybe completely by changing the underlying infrastructure and the tech stack it runs on. And that could be a real material improvement. Maybe it makes the product a lot faster. But that wouldn't really be included in your framework on monetization, engagement, and acquisition. So remember, there's always a bunch of different ways to look at these things. Super useful to have like a default framework like that, but remember to keep an open mind, because depending on the question that comes up, there could be, you know, a myriad of different ways to like explore it and you know, make improvements. Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. Hopefully this was useful. I enjoyed chatting with all of you about PM interview prep. If you check out RocketBlocks, I hope you have a good experience. And if folks have feedback or questions, you know, feel free to follow me on LinkedIn or reach out there. I'm happy to help, and best of luck to everyone in your journeys into product management.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Kenton. I have posted his LinkedIn in the chat. Feel free to give him a follow. You know, he posts a lot of good content on LinkedIn as well. And feel free to check out RocketBlocks as well. Amazing content on that website as well. And, you know, if you do sign up for coaching, I'm sure you're going to see some impact on your journey there. Again, thank you so much for joining us, Kenton. And I really appreciate you making time for us here. With that, I'd like to, my pleasure. And with that, I would like to conclude today's event. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Thank you for all the questions that you asked. And we hope to see you guys next time as well. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.